Welcome to Scrolling to Death. I'm really excited to bring you in on a conversation I had with a college professor in Georgia named Dr. Jason Robinson. This was such an interesting conversation about screens in schools, and I think you'll find it equally fascinating. This interview is part of a larger project that I'm working on, studying how our kids are using technology in schools. I'm interviewing teachers and administrators. I'm trying to help parents figure out how to manage our kids' technology use in schools and with their school devices at home as well. So let's get into this chat with Dr. Robinson.
My name is Dr. Jason Robinson. I am a senior lecturer at the University of North Georgia, the Oconee campus. I specifically teach chemistry for non-majors. The vast majority of my students are pre-nursing as well as have a lot of business majors. Just because of the way the curriculum, the matriculation plan is set in the state of Georgia, you have to either take chemistry or biology. And so it's 50-50 if they're not nursing.
Okay. Chemistry was hard for me.
Yeah, I try to make it as palatable as possible.
Yeah. I thought I was going to go pre-med, and I was like, nope, can't do OChem.
Yeah, that's what I'm actually teaching. I'm actually teaching an OChem for non-majors right now, and there's a lot of crying. And it's funny. My dad was teaching me. My dad's an organic chemist, and he was teaching me organic chemistry at like 14, and I was like, I'm never going to use this. Then I go to grad school and I use it every single day. So
amazing.
It's a little bit of circuity there.
That's cool. How long have you been teaching for?
I have been teaching at this institution. This will be my 8th year.
Cool.
Prior to that, I taught privately for private business entities. I worked in corporate America before that, but I also did teach. So I think altogether, I have been providing instruction for about 10 years cumulatively.
Great. Okay. And so you instruct college students, but also some high school students. Can you explain that?
Yes. The state of Georgia has a dual enrollment program. It is really focused on looking at students that are junior level and above. So rising juniors and above can apply, and they take the same classes as I guess you would call it a traditional or non-traditional college student take. And I'm very fortunate, I'm in an institution where we encourage it, and we have students that every year we always have a couple students that will graduate with an associate's degree literally days before they walk for their high school diploma. So I'm extremely proud of that. I've had some students do that, and very, very motivated students, and there's the opportunity for them to earn those credits, the dual enrolled credits that count for high school and towards college.
Okay, so this is going to be an interesting conversation. We go into device use because these are super motivated kids that need to stay focused on their schoolwork. So having, smartphone habits would take away from that. But let's get into that. So first of all, are smartphones allowed in your classroom?
I allow them in my classroom. I've kind of reached this tipping point where I allow them in my classroom. I've encouraged their use for class-related materials, but now I'm going to a point where I'm going to restrict their use. When I first started teaching, you would see the student kind of lean over and peep at their phone, but now they'll just, second row. And I don't teach in a large lecture hall. So I have one of the largest classes at 32 students. They'll be, feet away from me, and they'll just be, on their phone typing away. And I can see what they're doing because I walk around. I'm very mobile when I teach, and I try to engage students. And I can literally see them on Instagram. I can see them on TikTok. I can see them on Kick or whatever they're on. And it's just I'm at that tipping point right now where I'm not very happy with it. But I don't really try and change things mid-semester because when you're in college, how you start is really generally how you need to finish. You can get easier, but you can't get tougher. You just can't. They'll dig their heels in, and then it just turns into an adversarial relationship where I try to be more of a mentor than an adversary for them, especially with my organic students, because organic is hard enough. So I want to treat it as a common adversary because it's not an easy class for me to teach just because it's almost like trying to explain to someone how to tie your shoe. You can do it, but trying to explain it is very difficult.
Nah, that's a great analogy. So they're kind of using it brazenly, like right in front of you.
Absolutely.
So they don't even pretend to use it for school.
There's no pretending. There's no kind of surreptitious use. That old lean, or they'd have in front of their computer, and you think they're taking notes, and they're really not. It's really brazen, and that's where when I first noticed it, I tried to include it because in my chemistry class, we talk a lot about a lot of current events, and I really try to tie the current events in because these students are not going to be chemistry majors. At best, the most science they're going to touch is they might be a nurse, a nutritionist, respiratory therapist, somewhere along that line. Mm-hmm. And so I don't want to make chemistry so bad for them that they're going to walk away forever and they're going to be like, no, I hate this. Ultimately, my goal is to make it palatable and make it something that they can use on a daily basis and something that they'll at least understand, because especially if you're going to be my nurse when I'm old, I want them to have some knowledge of or some practical application of what they're doing.
Yeah. Okay. What have you noticed over time? Kids, I assume, have been using their smartphones more in the classroom.
Definitely there's less focus than there has been. I think the point that I try to drive home to them is they have all the knowledge in the world at their fingertips. Mm-hmm. And what I really want them to do is I want them to understand that if you have this tool, that you need to be able to use this tool. And when I talk to them and I'm saying, hey, I need you to find this information, like if we're talking about, if we're talking a couple of summers ago, I guess when that whole submersible thing was going on, all of a sudden my kids were really into gas laws and pressure and things like that. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's where it started to tip a little bit, because I was like, hey, Google this, hey, Google that, hey, I need to know this. And it really keeps them involved. And so they need that device to pull the information. Mm-hmm. I try to engage them to where they want to be able to find the information, because mm-hmm. it's somewhat silly that you have all of the information that you need in the world in front of you, yet you don't know how to access it. And that's I think my biggest pet peeve. And if they were able to access the information, if they were able to find what I was looking for, I wouldn't have such an issue, because it would be more of a tool than a toy. But some of my students are really stuck in this toy mode, and they don't know how to put them down. They don't know how to let them go.
Mm-hmm. So they're treating it like a toy, not a tool.
Yes, it's an entertainment. It's a pacifier. It really has become, for some students, as a digital pacifier. And I'm very fortunate that we have great counseling services on our campus, because I've had to refer students for their social media use, and it's a real problem. I had a student a couple of years ago that would be up to 3-4 in the morning because she was making sure that all of her friends were accepting of what she was doing on Twitter, back when it was Twitter. Mm-hmm. And I ended up referring her, and the student came back, and she just outright failed my class, which I'm not one of those instructors that really enjoys giving Fs, because I don't want you to fail. I don't want you to have a negative association with science just because there's applications every day. But this student became so engrossed that they failed the class, but came back, sought treatment, and became a rock star. Absolute rock star. But I don't necessarily know if whoever's paying for their college education understands that this is a real issue, that they really understand how deep this rabbit hole goes of inattention and inability to focus, when my class is not that difficult. It's more of I need you to show me what you can do, but if you're so focused on your device, I can't work with that. I need you to meet me halfway.
Do they have laptops and phones usually?
Generally, it's about 50-50 now. Okay. It really is about 50-50. What I have seen and what I'm encouraged by is there are more students taking notes on tablets like iPads or Samsung tablets. Mm-hmm. They're physically writing, because in my class, the muscle memory is very important. And I can also see what they're doing, because they're going to, you don't write like this on a tablet, you have it down. So I can see if there's a video playing, because again, I'm in a very small classroom. Yeah. So I can see if there's video playing, but if they're on a tablet, I can see that they're actually writing the material, and they are, that they're engaged in the class. But with a lot of students have laptops, and that's one of the reasons why I'm so mobile when I walk around, is that I can see what they're doing, and I'll turn my head and I'll call them out. Like, I've just gotten to the point where I'm like, hey, you don't need to be shopping on Amazon right now. We're talking about, molarity or stoichiometry, all the things they really love to talk about. Yeah.
What about headphones? Are they often trying to sneak their headphones in?
The old one AirPod in the ear thing, they do that a lot. I try to make so much eye contact that it makes it very difficult. Mm-hmm. But also being in a small classroom helps me, because I'm not in a giant lecture hall. So I can see both of their ears generally, and I'm walking around and going. Yeah. And I know in the back of my head some of them are probably listening to music, but some of them they're also using that to kind of help them focus. So it's kind of music in one ear, lecture in the other. And as I've grown as an instructor over time, I realized that things that seem like they're not paying attention there are some students that's what works for them.
Interesting.
I had a student the other day that was knitting, and she's a solid A student. And I felt some kind of way about it. But when I talked to the student, the takeaway was, I really wish you just told me, because she's a rock solid A, can tell me exactly what's going on. But the way her brain works, she has to be doing something with her hands.
Yeah. Well, they're like master multitaskers, these kids, And
Yes.
I'm reading a book by Dr. Gloria Mark right now about multitasking, and so I'll have a episode soon about that, and it's going to be really interesting because her point is you actually do everything worse when you're trying to multitask. So after years of research, but it's people like you, I hear this all the time, that they just, even my husband, like that background music, like really helps him focus. So it's an interesting conversation.
One point I'd like to make is that sometimes they will listen to something specifically to tie it together. So they have kind of a pace or a timeline to their thought process. So that's something that I have seen before, is that they'll listen to one thing and they're able to tie it together, and it gives them something to recall. It kind of gives them a linchpin to recall. But those are very, very specific cases with very specific students.
Yeah.
But by and large, generally I try to make it so engaging that they'll pop that AirPod out as, kind of a respect thing, or just knowing that I'm just going to leer at them until they take it out.
Yeah. Any conflicts with a student that stand out to you over a device?
Not necessarily. I think I've had one conflict with a student over a device, but generally how you start is very important. I'm by no means a dictator in the classroom, but I'm very serious about things, and so I start with a little bit of edge, and then it kind of wears off a little bit. And students now, they read my Rate My Professor, and they understand kind of the deal with that. But invariably, there's going to be some conflict. I mean, mathematically speaking, when you have hundreds of students, at some point you're gonna run across one that's gonna try you. But over devices, generally when I say something once, I don't really have an issue, just for the fact that they understand that I don't necessarily play when it comes to things like that, because generally it's like, hey, put that up, and then they'll put that up. But if it turns into anything more, I'll be like, look, someone is paying for all of these people getting education, and right now you're stopping that. You're directly interfering with that. And once they kind of think about that, they'll put it away. It's never been an issue where, anything that's, ever made social media in my class about, me having to get loud or anything like that, because that's just not my style. I really want them. Of course, you're going to respect me because I'm your instructor, but at the same time, I don't want to be a dictator, because, fear, we overcome fear, but respect is something that's a little bit more important to me than being feared.
I'm anticipating I'm going to hear a difference from high school teachers in a high school versus what you're experiencing with college students. It's sounding like the maturity levels and the respect levels are pretty good for your students. They
are. With my high school students, I don't think in all my years I have ever given a B to a high school student. I honestly don't. I honestly don't think, because when they come to me, they have their head straight on. Like, they know, I've got this, I've got that, I've got these other things I got to do. I'm not here to play. I'm here to get this grade, because also this is going to count towards their graduation as well. In person, online, different story. But in person, I don't think I've ever given a B to a high school student. The college students, definitely, they have a little bit more sense of purpose, because if they're kind of just like leaves that's getting blown around by the wind, I generally try to address that by the second week. We have policies and procedures in place to kind of address that and kind of get them motivated. Because I tell them straight up, when I get my final roster, I know what your high school GPA is. I know, where you sit, SAT, ACT, wherever. I take that time to go in because I want to be able to reach you.
Yeah.
I want to know what's going on. If you've taken chemistry a bunch of times, we'll talk and be like, hey, what's going on? What were the roadblocks? But it's generally, there's only been a couple times where they're like, hey, I'm addicted to this device. And I tend to be that instructor that students will come cry in my office. Like, I keep tissues and I try to reach them and say, look, this thing is killing you. And one of the things I'll do with those students, and it drives them nuts, is I'll just ask them to put their device on my side of the desk, and I'll have a conversation with them, and I will count how many times their eyes go to their device. One of the things I teach my students is the only thing that you really love in this world is dopamine, and it's the chemical in your brain. It's the pleasure center, and so with them, that's their release. That's what gives them the dopamine. And when you seemingly take it away, because I don't physically take their device, and they give it to me voluntarily. I don't take their device. We just put it down on my side of the table, and it helps them illustrate the point that, hey, maybe I need to figure out some way to not be so attached to this thing, because it is. If you think about it, I'm old enough to remember when all a cell phone could do was make a phone call. You texting, right. I remember the first text message I got. I didn't even know how to get it. But being able to see them as digital natives, that phone is so much to them that it's their pacifier, it's their friend, it's their communication device, it's their amusement. It's so many things all at once to them. But at some point, we have to, as instructors, we have to teach them that you need to be able to function without this for some period of time.
Right. And that's the problem. A lot of them can't.
No. And to the extreme, I have a lecture that I can pretty much do off the top of my head. And so what I do is I tell them, turn on every notification you got on your phone. Turn it on. TikTok, Snapchat, Facebook, whatever you're using, turn it on so it's audible. And I power forward and I try to lecture through the cacophony of sounds that go off. And so what I'll do is I'll also have another student keep track. And so if somebody gets a message, they get a Snapchat message, they'll shout out Snapchat, and then they'll tally mark. And the point for them is to see that how can you focus on this if you're so focused on what's happening in the outside world? Like, the outside world can wait for a little while.
Yeah.
But they struggle to understand that the outside world can wait for a little while. It's this constant sense of connection that they have been born with. They've been born into this constant sense of connection, and we take that away from them. Sometimes they struggle. Some students, you ask them if they have a phone, they can't find it, they don't care. But that's becoming very rare. They basically walk in. I tell a story. I was in the men's restroom at our school, and a student stepped out of the stall, pants around ankles, text messaging, and that is like the bar. That is the craziest thing that I think I've ever seen with a student that is so enamored by what is going on that they are completely unaware of their surroundings. Like literally pants around ankles. And another instructor and I were in there and just looked like, this is how bad it is. This is rock meat bottom. This is where we are.
Wow. Okay, so you're planning for next year to put in place some kind of smartphone ban or...
Cubbies.
Okay, so tell me about that.
We have cubbies for backpacks in some of our lab. I am going to request a smartphone cubby, just like a mobile cubby that I will wheel around campus. That's yet another joy of my campus. It is small enough for me to wheel around a cubby. And I'm just going to have the students. Put it in the cubby. I don't have the money like Dave Chappelle to go to that vault system where they can just put it in and it'll lock it up for the show. Yeah. But I'm going to go with cubbies next semester. Just to get them the idea that you can put this thing down. Because we talk in my part 2 class, so I teach part 1 and part 2. Most of the students take part 1. You're only going to take part 2 if you're nursing or computer science or something like that. But we talk about addiction, and we talk about cycles of addiction and everything else. And we talk about the brain chemistry behind addiction. And that's when I think it starts to click like, hey, this might be an issue, because with these being pre-nursing students, they're going to see, chemical addiction, chemical substance addiction, but also behavioral addiction is a thing, and it's going to be driven by the chemicals in your brain. So it's something that gives them a practical application, but it's also going to give me a little bit more peace to understand like, hey, at least they're focused enough to know, okay, my phone is safe, but I can't get to it.
Yeah. You can't technically require that they put it in there, can you?
I gotta check on that.
Yeah.
I can ask very, very nicely. It's kind of uncharted territory.
Right.
But I don't know. It's going to be one of those things where I'm just going to leer. I'm probably just going to leer and go from there, because I have the ability in laboratory. I have a lot more control in laboratory, because if it's a safety risk, it's a safety risk. But the whole campus safety issue, If it's in a cubby, it's not. I don't know if it's not going to be a locked cubby, but it's just going to be someplace where they can come get their phone.
Right.
And I don't think that's going to be the issue because I can say no phones in my classroom.
Okay.
There are very few instances where I can say if student has an accommodation, I can't say I can't record that, but I have a lot of discretion and leeway as to what I can say in my classroom. And last I checked, I do have the ability to say, hey, look, no electronic devices unless you have an accommodation, which, happy to work with you on that.
Right. Yeah. And lots of parents, when I bring up this issue, they say, what if your kid has a medical issue that they need their phone? And obviously schools have exemptions for that, right?
Oh, absolutely. But, there's always going to be someone that's going to say, oh, look, I need this for this, or I need this for that. And I try to encourage them to really ask yourself, do you really need it? Now, if you're using your phone to monitor your glucose, that's one thing.
Yeah,
but
correct.
If you're using your phone to keep an eye on your dog just for giggles at the house, that's a whole different thing. Mm-hmm. And so I always kind of try to get them to utilize their resources. If they have a legitimate need, then if they're monitoring their glucose, I'm going to have them go to student services to get that documentation. So when I come down with the hammer, they can say, "Look, I've got the paperwork," and it just teaches them. It teaches them, hey. If this is something that is real, I need to understand how to use this because this is something that's going to affect every aspect of my life. But if it's not something that's covered or something that's quote unquote real, then I need you to understand there's going to be jobs. I've worked in pulp and paper. I've worked in aircraft. I've worked in automotive. You cannot be on your phone. You just can't in those jobs. You cannot do that. And so there has to be an expectation. I tell my students, you're here because you want to be a professional something. So you can't be a nurse practitioner and seeing a patient and be like, oh, hold on, I got to check this TikTok real quick. It doesn't work. No. You are going to get fired doing that. Yeah.
People comment that a lot. We're not allowed to use it at work. So why are they allowed to use it in the classroom? I don't know. That's not setting them up for success.
And being a teacher and actually being married to another college instructor, we have a lot of conversations about this, the appropriate use of technology. And I don't have a problem if you're engaged in the class and using it because it can be a tool. If you go into corporate America, that's going to be a tool that they give you. But if you're going to go be a plumber, you might need it for something. But you need to be focused on what you're doing.
Yeah.
That's what it is. And not to disparage anyone that has that job or anything, because again, I tell people, and I'm that college professor that's look, college is not for everyone, but regardless of the job that you're going to go into, you need to show up with the ability to focus. And there is absolutely nothing wrong with being a plumber, welder, whatever. You're going to need to know how to use that technology, but there are going to be instances in your job where it might be life and death, and you need to be able to pay attention.
Yeah, 100%. Well, I can't wait to see how the cubby system works for you.
I can't wait to submit that requisition to be you want a cubby on wheels? I'm like, this is what I'm about to do. Yeah, we have the expectation that they put their stuff up for laboratory. So the lecture is not going to be an issue. And generally, where I am, I don't really have a lot of students that are combative just for the sake of being combative.
Yeah.
And also, we have the ability to kind of mitigate some of the issues where they're like, oh, well, I'm concerned about their safety and everything else, and then we can kind of address the safety issue from another standpoint. But I generally, again, with us being in higher ed, FERPA hits us a little bit differently, so I don't talk to parents. I do not. I'm going to skip
my whole line of questioning around parents because that's the whole thing.
Yeah, and it's just because of the way that FERPA works for college students. I do not talk to parents at all because you can get in a lot of trouble. But I don't necessarily have that issue. And again, generally, if you set the tone for student success, you're just saying, look, you're away from your phone. If there's a safety issue, there's a phone there.
Right.
I have a phone in my lab. So if there's a safety issue, the campus police number is right above there. So if you need that, there you go. And it's a legitimate concern. How founded it is, I don't necessarily know.
Right.
But at some point, we as, I'm a parent as well. We have to be able to say, look, you need to be able to function without this device for some period of time.
Yeah. How old are your kids?
I have a 9-year-old going on
retirement. Okay.
He's very grown.
He's very grown.
Very grown. grew up in a house with 2 PhDs. That dude,
Yeah.
that dude is very grown.
Yeah, cool. So if I were to ask you, I'm just going to ask you straight up, do smartphones belong in the classroom?
I'm going to say no. In my classroom, I'm going to say no. And
Okay.
I use the following analogy because I generally get pushback. I tell students that during the Apollo 13 mission, they had to rewrite the ignition sequence in the margins of the books that they took up into space with them. They didn't bring any extra paper. You know, space is all about weight and what you can carry. If they can do that, you can do my chemistry class with a pencil and a piece of paper. You really can. Now, I understand that there might be some issues where students who may fall out of kind of the bell curve of students with regard to anything. They may need some assistance with a device, but that's really the only instance where I want to go. I really want to go back to pencil and paper. And this is the same reason the homework in my class counts for 0 points. It does not count for a grade. Simply for the fact that I don't want to teach students how to cheat. I don't want them to put that into part of their, oh, hey, you put these questions online. Let me go Google the answers instead of trying to figure out how to do that. It's more of teaching the proper behavior of, I want you to be able to do this with a pencil and paper, because if NASA can do that with a bunch of people's lives, in the balance, you can sit here for 50 minutes and we can talk about, chemical reactions, and you don't need some other input in going into your brain other than, what's up on the board.
Yeah, and I think it's like the kids absorb 20% more from pencil and paper versus looking at something on a digital screen.
It is. And the one thing I teach them, because in my class, the tests are pencil and paper, they're starting to realize now how important muscle memory is when they're working some of these chemistry problems. Because once they get that muscle memory, and we're working through stoichiometry, which is one of the most difficult aspects of basic chemistry. It's how to make something into something else and how much you need. But if they get that muscle memory from actually writing it out, it's so much easier for them to do it on the test, because then they understand, okay, this number goes here, because mathematically they understand how to put numbers into spots in equations. They completely understand how to do that. The translation to a calculator, they kind of understand. But when they write it out, it forces them to develop that muscle memory so that they understand, this is what I'm doing. And you always get the question, well, I'll be able to do this, and I'll be able to do this on a computer. And I'm like, what happens if you don't? I'm like, pencil, paper never requires a charger. It never requires electricity. It works. Just trust me.
I love that. And would you also say in high school settings, do smartphones belong in the classroom in a high school setting?
Absolutely not. In high school settings, absolutely not. We look at the biology of the high school mind. There's too much going on. I'm not a fan of even the level of technology that my son uses in the 3rd grade. I get it. The textbooks our class set textbooks or textbooks for every student are not a thing anymore. But it commingles so many things when they're just looking at a screen all day. It's something that I'm struggling with as a parent and as an educator, because yes, there are certain advantages, but in high school should be preparatory. And if we're not prepping them, because if you think about it, high school is where things kind of split traditionally. You have your students that are going to go, military, vocational, or your students that are going to go to college, but either way, they should be prepared for what comes next in their life. High school should be, if you think about it, graduating high school is a giant deal for some people.
My oldest is in 2nd grade, and I also have issue with the amount of technology use that they have for these younger kids. And is your son required to bring his device home with him?
He's not required. He does, but we've gotten to the point with my son that he will bring it home, but he generally only uses his school issue device. I can say it's locked down pretty tight.
Okay.
But what we did find out during the pandemic was he would be paying attention to what's going on and could answer because during the pandemic we were both teaching from home, and so we were listening to what he was doing, but we were never really watching him. So we could hear him being engaged in the conversation but what we found out eventually was he figured out how to open another tab and how to mute PBS Kids. And so he would be playing PBS Kids while completely listening to what the teachers are talking about. He would go knock his work out, and then he'd be off, playing one of the PBS Kids games. But as they get older, we're kind of in this brave new world, but as they get older, if you're preparing them for what comes next, if you're preparing to release them either into vocational, military, that job market, or they're going off to college, they have to be able to put it down. They just need to be able to put it down. That is the simple truth. We have so many issues with, I live in an old house, so we're on a first name basis with our plumbers and our electricians. And so when they come over, we always talk about, are they able to find people, because they're getting older and they say, look, they can't get off their phones. They can't do this. They can't do that. And I'm sitting here and I'm paying these plumbers ridiculous, people are like, oh, well, I don't want to do that. But when I'm sitting here looking at my plumbing bill, I'm like, hey, you might want to do that. But they're telling me the same thing. They can't, they can't do this, they can't do that. I'm having trouble filling it. And yet, our water line broke under our driveway. Huge repair. I'm sitting here thinking it's going to be a crew of guys coming out with shovels. They show up with this digging robot.
Ooh, cool.
And they literally in 20 minutes dug a trench in my whole yard. Dug this,
wow.
I think it was probably 60, 70 foot long trench in 20 minutes with the coolest looking robot I've ever seen.
Wow.
And so I'm sitting here and I'm like, there's a space for technology here. There's a space for technology regardless of what you're doing, but it needs to be the appropriate space. And I'm kind of like the warning bell, hey, I'm kind of like, hey, you need to figure out, especially if you're in my class, you need to figure out if this is something that you can do, because professionally, this is not going to be acceptable. You can't do this and go, you can't do this and say, oh, I want to work in a NICU and, deal with premature babies, and you got your dirty cell phone in there.
Right. I know.
You can't do that. You need to be able to walk away.
Yeah. And it brings us back to what you said about using it as a tool, not a toy. If I asked you, does technology make your job easier or harder?
Oh, that's a tough question. I think technology has made me. I think it's made me a better instructor. I don't know if it's gone either way. I think understanding my students and understanding the technology that they use on a daily basis, I feel like that has made me a better instructor. But I don't know if it's necessarily made my job easier or harder.
Okay.
Because there are things, understanding technology, I use Discord in my classroom. I was, I think, the first person on my campus to use Discord education in the classroom. And I use that as a means to allow them to communicate with each other in a more native format, because I have my male students who are all, they play video games. They're like, oh, hey, I'm already on Discord. Perfect. But it's also a way for me to do virtual office hours. It's also a way for me to reach students. If I need to push a notification to them, I can push. They're more likely to check Discord than they are their email. And of course, the caveat being no sensitive information goes over Discord, but it may be like, hey, I posted a study guide, go look at it.
Right.
But on the other hand, we're having these issues now with generative AI, with students being able to find homework answers online. So I don't think it's necessarily made it easier or harder. I think it's just it's forced me to be a better instructor and be able to work around. I always tell my students, if you remember in the 1980s, the United States was going to put space lasers up there. They were going to put lasers up in space, and very complicated. It was the Star Wars. It was Strategic Defense Initiative. And the Russians figured out the easiest way to stop it was not some super complex, thing. It was just build a missile and fill it with sand. And you're just like, wow, how does that work? And it's like, well, you have these complex lasers and mirrors, throw some sand at it, and it's just going to tear it up. I always try to explain to them that no matter how complicated a solution that they create, there's generally a simple way to counter it. And so that's why I'm a pencil and paper instructor as much as I can be, because I want them to be able to master the basics before you start showing me, oh, well, I can do this, this, and this on my phone. I'm like, show me if you can do this on a piece of paper.
Yeah.
Because that's the acid test. There's no generative AI when you're using a pencil and a piece of paper. There's nothing for that.
Yeah. I think it's interesting because you're working with mostly adults, right? So you have to have a mutual respect. And I love that you understand what technology they use and then use that to the advantage of your communication in the classroom.
I have to.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I have to meet them where they are. I have the luxury of having, I have a large percentage of non-traditional students. Mm-hmm. So I have students that are coming out of the military. I have students that maybe they went to college too early and they come back and they're, they're a little bit more prepared. Mm-hmm. But you have to be able to meet them where they are. And there's a lot of candor that comes in that. And part of that candor is saying, look, if you really want to excel in this, you need to be able to focus. You need to be able to find that focus. Mm-hmm. And you talk to your students, if you understand what's going on with them. And again, I have that luxury because I'm not, in this super tight, K through 12 environment where everything is strictly, so strictly regulated. Yeah. But if you talk to them and you say, look, they'll come to you and be like, oh, I didn't sleep so well last night. First question, how much sleep did you get? Right. How late were you on your phone? Do you have the blue light filter on or off? Then we talk. Then I can introduce the science. Let me tell you what the blue light tells your brain, and then telling my students. Now I've got a bunch of them that are leaving their phones in their bathroom to charge because they can still hear the alarm when it goes off. Because again, it's this multi-purpose device, mm-hmm. but you have to be able to draw the line. And I tell them, look, give me a week. Give me a week of plugging your phone in, charging it in your bathroom. Your alarm is still loud enough for you to hear it. Yep. And see if you sleep better.
Yeah. I love that. They could just also buy a cheap alarm clock off Amazon.
Oh, yeah. But it's like,
God forbid.
It's so funny because they're like, what's an alarm clock? And I'm like, not worth the argument. Plug it in the bathroom. You'll still be able to hear it.
And I love that, putting it in the bathroom. And I would say the meet them where they're at, I would argue that applies to college students, but I would not want high school teachers. God, it's tough because Discord specifically, there are a lot of predators on Discord. So if you have minors mm-hmm. on a platform where they can interact with strangers, even, you may have a lockdown like you're in this chat.
Yeah, that's the way mine is. Mine's locked down to where it's basically you have to request entry into the server, and then I have to approve you, and I do that on an individual basis. But yeah, okay, absolutely. Yeah. With regard to minors, it doesn't. I wouldn't want my, my son was playing Among Us on a public server one day, and he just kind of migrated because, again, he's essentially feral. Mm-hmm. He figured out how to get on there, mm-hmm. and we had the conversation about it, and he understood why I wasn't really, I didn't blame him, but I wasn't happy with where he ended up. Yeah. But minor, that's a huge deal is safety. That's a whole other conversation with high schoolers yep. about the amount of trouble that they can get in getting catfished, sexual predator scams. Mm-hmm. These are real things, and I'm generally the first day of class, I find the most horrific video that I can show them, and not even just terrible, just to be terrible, but I have a video of a ported cow. Mm-hmm. The cows, they have a port put in the side of them. They use them to study cow nutrition. Okay. And the students are like, well, what does this have to do? And I'm like, I guarantee you where we are, you passed ported cows getting to campus. Mm. And they're like, oh, that's so gross and disgusting. I'm like, what do you want to do again when you grow up? Oh, I want to be a nurse. And I'm like, and you can't stand a cow that mm-hmm. has a piece of plastic on the side of it? But reaching them where they are, right? But also understanding what's appropriate for each age level is absolutely key. But in high school, no. High school, they're just dealing with getting over all of the emotions of middle school and the new hormones and everything else. And high school just makes it a mess. I'm terrified. I'm terrified of teaching in a high school.
I know.
Absolutely terrified.
Yep. I'm terrified of hearing the stories of teaching in high school. Anything else you want to share about smartphones in school, technology in school?
I definitely believe that there's a place for it because there's going to be technology in the workplace. But you have to ask yourself what's appropriate, what's an appropriate amount of exposure for where you are. Mm-hmm. If you're in a class of, I teach what would traditionally be freshmen. If you're in that class, they're barely learning how to adult. So that's why I try to take as many things away as I can so they can learn the basics of adulting, because there's this weird irony that they have all of the knowledge collectively in the world in their pocket or on the desk in front of them, mm-hmm. yet they don't know how to use it properly mm-hmm. for the context. You ask them, okay, I need you to find this, and I'm like, I don't know how to do that. And it's like, but you have this thing right here that you can use. Mm-hmm. you have to teach them the appropriate use of the appropriate use of the devices they have and how to be productive. And there's a time for it. There's a time to, if you just got to veg out for 20 minutes, there's a place for that. It's not during the middle of my lecture on acids and bases. That's not the time.
No. And unfortunately, these, especially the social media platforms, are built to be way too addictive that you can't just do 20 minutes. Like just literally physically is addicting your brain to do it as long as you possibly can over all other productive activities.
It is an addiction. And if we approach it, because the students always look at me like, how do you know this stuff? And I'm like, because these are things that are important and applicable. And I talk to, especially my kids in organic, when we start talking about brain chemistry, I talk about how we used to look at, as a society, we looked at things like alcoholism as a moral failing. And we didn't understand the brain chemistry and the science behind alcoholism. But we've since evolved, and we have to evolve our thinking to understand, like, hey, this is serious. Because as I was grappling with this morning, how in the world are we so addicted to something that we can take a $2.99 tote bag from Trader Joe's and then decide we're going to sell it for hundreds of dollars on eBay? We have become so focused and fixated on things that they become these kind of weird self-fulfilling things, like these self-fulfilling actions. Because if we look at all the distractions that are available to students, you talk about these tote bags, you talk about the Stanley Cups. Kids are now getting bullied here behind Stanley Cups.
What?
Their kids getting bullied behind. Yes, kids are getting bullied behind Stanley Cups. There are schools that are literally banning them right now. All of these distractions that you would not think are distractions. It's a cup. But if we continue to put these distractions in, how are they going to learn? Because it boggles the science of addiction is mind-boggling. I'm not an expert, but I'm married. I mean, my wife's a neuroscientist, so we can talk.
Cool.
But understanding how addiction works, understanding how we want to belong, I get why students are attached to their phones. But I also get that bridges still need to be built, planes still need to fly, and you can't do those things while you're surfing the internet or you're on your favorite social media platform. It just doesn't work.
Yeah, there's too much toy, not enough tool. And teachers aren't provided with resources to teach the kids how to use the phones. I mean, they're just having to fight it and try to put it away. Yeah, we're not at a good place so far from what I'm learning, especially in the high school setting. No,
and I sit on a technology board for the local school district, and we had a meeting last week and we were talking about that. And you really have to get buy-in from the students to understand, I'm doing this for your own good. And it's a student to student thing, because then you have a lot more input from parents as well. They're saying, oh, well, I want my kid to be safe. And it's like, it can be safe in their pocket, but I need it not to be out.
They want them to be, their phone's going to make them safe.
That's the idea. That's the idea, that there's this safety thing. Oh, I need to get in touch with my student all the time. It's this connection that we feel, and I get it, but it's also the reason that human memory is declined, because we take pictures of everything. I ask my students, if you had to call your parents right now from my phone, could you do it?
Hell no.
Like, no, I don't know their number. Human memory has declined because of the availability of things that supplant it. If there's nothing driving your memory, you don't need it. If your brain doesn't use it, you lose it. So if you're not in a position where you don't know phone numbers, that's where you need to start asking yourself, why don't I know phone numbers? Oh, well, I can use my phone. What happens when your phone breaks? Do you have that contingent? And that's why with my son, I'm like, hey, you need to know my number. You need to know your mom's number. You need to know your grandparents' number. You need to be able to rattle these things off, because there's not always going to be a time where you have your phone. And it's something as simple as, oh, I dropped my phone in the pool and it doesn't work. Who are you going to call? How are you going to get home?
Right. The safety conversation comes up a lot, and parents do want their kids to have a device on them so they can get a hold of them. And a lot of parents in the United States will say, if there's a school shooting, I need to be able to get a hold of my child. It becomes
a slippery slope.
Yeah.
That's why I have to kind of adjust my posture a little bit. You want to be able to get a hold of your child, but there has to be an expectation that this is for emergencies. there has to be a clear expectation that this is for emergencies, because if you don't set that expectation, it becomes this is for whatever.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
I mean, if you don't set expectations and if you don't enforce those expectations, there are no expectations. So you're saying, okay, well, I have this phone, I can do whatever. But if you say, look, this phone is only for emergencies, and if you stick to that, then you don't necessarily. They're gonna be like, well, this is what I use it for, is for emergencies. I don't need it for all these other things.
Yeah.
But I really struggle with that, being an educator as long as I have been, and working in other industries. When people say, oh, well, we're doing all this for the safety of my child. Like, I get it. I absolutely get it. But I send my kid to school every single day without a phone.
Right.
Every single day. And there are students in his class that have Apple Watches that are just programmed to where the parents know where they are and there's an emergency. And I'm kind of warming up to that idea. Mm-hmm. As my son is kind of here, there, and everywhere with activities, I'm warming up to that idea. Right. But we have to draw a line to say, okay, when do we say, okay, let's address the other issues, but the primary focus of school is to learn. It's not to constantly live in this state of I need to be connected, because if we teach them to be constantly connected, they will grow up to be adults that have to be constantly connected, and constantly connected and independent are mutually exclusive.
Yeah. Well, we're lucky with the kids, with ages our kids are in, that there are different phone products now that we can, that only do what you need them to do. If you only want your kid to be able to call you in an emergency and you can see where they are, get them a Bark phone or a Gab phone. There are products. Just so the phones for the younger kids should only do exactly what you want them to do. There should be no workaround. That's why iPhones are not okay for kids, because they were built for adults.
No.
It's insane.
But if your child understands how to use your phone better than you do, that is a problem. Mm-hmm. Because the other day I was having a conversation with my wife at the dinner table, and we were talking about Sweden's accession into NATO. Mm-hmm. And my son responds back with, well, they've been trying to get in because Turkey and Hungary had been blocking them. Mind you, this comes from a 9-year-old.
Oh, my God.
And, of course, there's instant silence because we both know this to be true. Mm-hmm. But the question is, well, where did you learn that? And he's like, oh, I saw it on a video.
YouTube or?
Yes. So we monitor his YouTube.
Yeah.
He's plugged into my algorithm. So if my algorithm changes, I know very quickly.
Okay, good. Yeah.
But they have the capacity to learn whatever they want to learn. Mm-hmm. But if you don't understand the technology, you are going to get burned by your kid, because they're going to go off and do something they have no business doing, because that mind, exactly. If you think a male mind is flooded with so much testosterone at 17, it's a wonder they can walk straight. It's science. It is science. There's so much testosterone floating in there. Yeah. So you give them a device where they can access almost anything, you are inviting trouble. And if you allow them access to that device over years, they understand how the ecosystem works. I have a friend who he is a sophomore in high school, and he is in a public school district, in a very well-funded public school district on the East Coast. And their friend group got together and figured out how to get around the adult content filter at their school. Jesus. And they were literally watching pornography in class. They figured out how to completely work around the system. And when he explained it to me, I was like, that is brilliant, but that is also terrible. Mm-hmm. Because I see the students are working and their minds are working to solve problems, but we're giving them the wrong problems to solve. And that's the danger of technology. If we don't moderate it, we're giving them the wrong problems to solve. They will be bored and they will figure out boys are going to do boy things. I have this conversation with my wife all the time. Why is he dirty? Because he's a boy. Boys generally do silly boy things. But if we don't put a handle on this, they can do, if you think about it, you can do real damage. And especially when you turn 16, 17 in a lot of states, that stuff sticks. Mm-hmm. It will travel with you for the rest of your life. Those mistakes become permanent mistakes.
Yep.
And so I always tell parents, one of the joys that I have is doing parent orientation. We talk about cell phone usage and device usage, and the overwhelming response that I've gotten from parents, especially that are parents that are paying for this out of pocket, they are not playing because they do not want their child to have to repeat a class and pay more money because their child doesn't have their head put on straight. Mm-hmm. So there is a place for it, but absolutely, if you have to set boundaries and you have to stick to them, you can't let iOS or Android raise your child. You can't do it.
Yeah.
So you have to be able to establish boundaries and be like, no. And if it means not being the cool kid because you don't have an iPhone 15, I'm sorry. Mm-hmm. Here, take this Gab, take this Bark phone. Because isn't that the hardest part of being in high school is the toughest lesson that you learn when you leave high school is I didn't need to be the cool one.
Right. And you wish you could go back and be like,
oh my gosh.
I wish I could just do what I was interested in and not try to
regular
be so
clothes.
Cool.
Just regular clothes, regular shoes, a watch that kind of worked.
Yeah.
But there's so much social pressure.
Yeah.
And you have to ask, well, where's the social pressure coming from? What they see.
TikTok.
Some kids you can get them to understand, hey, you don't necessarily need this because it's all these things that you'll never need. But with my son and kind of what I do and working with him, I give him a little bit more leeway to learn things that are skills that turn him from being a consumer into a producer. Mm-hmm. So like we like with Midjourney, he's learning how to use Midjourney because he's learning how to create art and how to interface and how to program. But there's a very fine line that says, look, he can do this. He can do this from my phone, and he enjoys doing that because he enjoys creating. Mm-hmm. But I need him to understand, hey, there's a line of this is what good creating is versus all these kids that I deal with and dealing with kids in juvenile justice system that created something that that put them in court and understanding the difference between the two because they simply don't understand. You can make awesome content from a phone.
Yeah.
Especially if you have a top-end iPhone, you can do amazing things, but you can also end up with a probation officer just that quick.
Yeah, and that's an awesome lesson. But they're being influenced by social media where there's, inappropriate, nude, sexual things, being pushed at them. So obviously they're going to think that that's cool or funny or normal. That's what their brains are doing. And people want to lead with them. They want to lead with kind of the emotional part of their brain versus the let's think this through and let's see what can really happen. Right.
But again, you're right. The social media influences, the peer pressure, all of these things have had these negative effects, but we have to, as educators and parents, we have to work to change this narrative to get them to understand that you don't need to have an iPhone. You need a phone. It's like I'll leave you with this story because I do realize we're running low on time.
Yeah.
Over the summer, my son spends his summers with my grandparents who live in the middle of nowhere. Mm-hmm. They have internet, but barely. They have enough for Netflix. So I went and saw my son. And we have a very tight-knit parent group. That's something I'm very thankful for. Very tight-knit parent group. Some of these kids have been together since pre-K. My son's in 3rd grade right now. Mm-hmm. They are super, super tight-knit. And so my son I talked to one of the parents. I was like, hey, they haven't seen each other in a month or two. Why don't we do a video call? Mm-hmm. If you ask yourself, what do you think my child and his best friend, since they were 5 years old for the past 4 or 5 years, they have been inseparable. They sat on the phone and talked about rocks.
Oh, I love that.
That's the thing.
They use technology to talk about something tangible.
They use technology to do that. But the question then becomes, what's the purpose of all of this extra? We want them to be able to communicate. We want them to be able to do these things. But if you're not mirroring your phone to where you can at any point see what your child's looking at, they can get led down a path very, very quickly, and it can kind of slip through your fingers.
Yeah.
That's why I'm happy with where my son goes to school. The technology, the way they run their technology, it's almost intrusive, but I respect that because the sites the kids can go to, vetted, verified sites. That there's not going to be anything inappropriate on those sites. Like I said, PBS Kids.
Right.
But we have to, as adults, we have to understand that this is an issue, and we have to be the adults in the room. We have to say, look, you're not going to get this iPhone. Because my son was like, well, I want a phone. And I'm like, well, why? And he's like, I want to be able to call my friends. I'm like, y'all talk about rocks. Mm-hmm. I'm like, go get on your bike. They live down the street. Go get on your bike, knock on the door, and see if they can come out and play.
Yeah, and play with rocks.
Yeah, it's like do some IRL social network or social interaction. Amazing.
Right.
But if we don't change something, we're going to be the generation that kind of watches Rome burn. And I hate to be dramatic or anything like that, but that's literally how I feel professionally. Mm-hmm. And as a parent, that I see and especially being involved in this community, I see so many kids that have all sorts of potential to be video editors, but they're putting just disgusting things out there, and they don't understand the ramifications because they're not thinking 2 steps ahead. But I sit and I see the things that get them in trouble, and I'm like, you have so much potential to make awesome content if you just had a different subject matter.
Right. How cool is Jason? Thank you guys so much for listening to this conversation. And as an update, Dr. Robinson was able to get cubbies in his classroom approved by the university. So he's looking forward to implementing that in the fall and seeing an increase in communication and attention in the classroom. Thank you guys for listening to this episode of Scrolling to Death. You'll be hearing a lot more from teachers like Dr. Robinson very soon.